So, one of the narratives that's being spread around by people who are pro critical race theory in schools is to basically kind of trunctuate the argument and say that people are just against black history being taught in schools. I attended a predominantly black school, and I learned during Black History Month about slavery. I learned about redlining. I learned about everything, really. It just this notion that people don't learn about black history in school just doesn't make any sense to me. I remember one conversation with one of the professors in one of the videos I watched where the person said that somehow her students were getting to her in college having never heard about slavery in school, which I find extremely unlikely. But anyway, so on this conversation was taking place in Progressives Against Neoliberalism. And it says, I can't believe we're actually fighting about whether or not teachers should be allowed to tell the truth in history class, which is a total straw man. Nobody's ever said that. But the problem is that what they want the truth to be includes a lot of other stuff that has nothing to do with history. So I replied, the regular curriculum already taught about slavery during Black History Month. All we talked about was black history. That's how I discovered one of my heroes, George Washington Carver. For those of you who don't know, he was an African-American scientist who innovated an insane amount of inventions just using peanuts. Anyway, I said CRT is not just telling us the truth. It's saying silly things like white babies are born racist. So I'm now doing my best to have a civil conversation with these people, and I'm giving them the opportunity to define for me what CRT is. Olivia Dargis says, school doesn't just teach us that does not teach us that white people literally used black skin as leather and that that the U.S. bombed an entire building full of black protesters. I don't know if all of that was, put into my education growing up, but some of the more grisly stuff doesn't need to be in middle school textbooks and maybe even high school textbooks. At the college level is when we should take the gloves off and tell people everything. I've always felt that way. But anyway, so Sarah Ann Gonzalez says, your ignorance about what critical race theory is why it is needed. Highlights that it is desperately needed. What we are taught had nothing to do with the structural racism. I know I was taught that racism died after the Civil Rights Movement. I've never been taught that. But anyway, that's not obviously true, and I went to school in the 1980s. My kids were taught much better in public schools, which is funded by property taxes, so obviously education differs from state to state and county to county. Take the time of educating yourself because obviously school failed you. And then I said, okay, you claim I am ignorant, so explain it to me, as everyone I ask to do so gives me vague information and doesn't seem to cover anything. Meanwhile, I read the curriculum pieces you can get on the internet and don't agree with any of them. I'm going to be sharing one of the ones that was actually circulated in my school nearby. Anyway, so we need to learn more about racial conflicts that happened many years ago. What else? Because one of the things she said was, were you taught about the Tulsa Race Massacre? As if this means that because we aren't just, talking about every single racial atrocity that's ever happened, we need critical race theory. And I said, yes, I was. But why is that critical? What difference in our lives today does it really make to add on more to the pile of racist conflicts that took place? Why is that so crucial? CRT doesn't seem to be expanded black history, and the people saying that opposing it is opposing black history are being hyperbolic. Sarah says, the word critical as to critique and put a critical lens on something, it's a way or framing of something. The fact that you know so little about it expresses how we so desperately need it in schools, she just repeats herself, since apparently fear-mongering seems to reach people at a deeper level than normative education seems to be able to. I did not, and most people I know did not know, this is about the Tulsa Race Massacre, about it until HBO and that is people from my age demographic all the way down to the Zoomers. And I said, so you're not even really aware of how much I've actually studied it, but I didn't just mean CRT at that point. Adding information about the Tulsa Race Massacre itself is not going to dramatically impact racism as it is understood today. I came away from my education in the 80s thinking racism was terrible, that slavery was terrible. We learned about the Tuskegee Airmen, and we learned, and a lot of other great black heroes, and we learned about slavery being a bad thing. So she said that she took the time to find something for me. It's an educational publication. I'll probably do a different video about that, but she never actually shares it, so I don't know what she's talking about. Anyway, now this conversation is really what made me decide to make this video, but from Yadira Agira, I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly, but Neil Kiernan, you tell me how much you don't know what CRT is without telling me you don't know what CRT is, Lamau. I said, well, then by all means, define it and explain it, as every person I talk to about it can't seem to do so. I know what the slides I have seen circulated say, and I don't agree with any of that. And she says, I'm glad you asked. Now real discussion can begin. Let me start with asking a couple questions. Indulge me, please. Do you think that the USA has systemic institutions that uphold racism? And I said, I grew up in the ghetto, and by that I mean gunshots on a regular basis. Next door neighbor was a crack dealer running a crack house, losing people I knew to drive-by shootings. Systemic racism is something I am willing to see, but when I ask people about it, all they provide me with are examples like Jim Crow and redlining that were many years ago. As a poor white trash kid, I came to the conclusion that there is systemic classism. The reason I don't feel it's race-based is if it was all about race, there would be rescue efforts to help white kids out of the ghettos. And there is not. And even in the predominantly white trailer park ghettos in the South, there are still no efforts to help white poor people. This is a point that she doesn't answer through this whole conversation, and one that nobody really ever wants to talk about. But really, if it was all about race, if this was all about white supremacy, why aren't there any efforts made to help poor white kids? Why aren't there any special programs like that? There isn't. And if anybody were to suggest any, they would be called racist. So then I gave the example of this Lean On Me inspirational speech, because this is a scene in the film where Morgan Freeman's character, who was based on a real person who I actually came and gave a talk at my school when I was growing up, pointed out that there were also kids in the school that were basically the white, being called white trash by the establishment that nobody cared about. That's the part of the poor people who live in these neighborhoods that are utterly invisible. And the kids who grew up in those situations, many of which are still there and are still poor because that's kind of the nature of things, are told that they're still white privileged somehow. But anyway, let's continue. She says, there's a reason they bring up redlining. The effects and consequences of redlining are occurring today. The ghetto you speak of, that's a consequence of redlining. Who lives predominantly in ghettos? Black and brown people. So you see, they created a place to contain black and brown people, and then they are over-policing it. The over-policing of the ghettos? Systemic racism. This over-policing means that there's more cops interacting with black and brown folks, which means that black and brown people are more likely to get killed by the cops. The disproportionate death of black and brown folks via police violence? Systemic racism. Now, I actually cover this in my video about the truth about police shootings. Statistically, what the real problem is that more people are getting shot by cops because, unfortunately, more people of color are currently, just due to cultural reasons, engaged in violent crime. I'll provide the link to that video at the end of this one. Anyway, I'm going to continue reading what she said. The over-policing also means that you're going to document more crime in neighborhoods that black and brown people live. This is where we get the black-on-black crime propaganda that is used to justify the over-policing of black and brown neighborhoods, like the ghettos that came about thanks to redlining. When the CIA pumped drugs into the ghetto during the 80s, systemic racism. The over-policing that is justified thanks to supposed black-on-black crime and the war on drugs leads to the bloated prisons filled with black and brown people. These for-profit prisons that are filled with the disproportionate numbers of black and brown folks is another example of systemic racism. I can go on and on. So these are going to be, I'm going to quote a little bit of what she said and give my answers. But anyway, she says, the ghetto you speak of, that's a consequence of redlining. So I say, okay, but ghettos exist all over the world, including in countries where there are no white people to blame it on, and in countries where there are only white people or mostly white people. And she says, who lives predominantly in the ghettos? I answer, poor people. She says, so you see, they created a place to contain black and brown people, and then they go, over-police it. So I'm not going to read the whole thing. Over-policing? I once called the police as we thought a burglar was literally in our house, and it took them 2 hours to respond. Throughout my childhood, I was beaten or robbed, and would generally take about an hour or more for them to show up. What is over-policing? The crime rates are huge in those areas. I know, I lived there. So we should what? Police less? Why do crime rates always go up in places like the Chaz Chop or the George Floyd Memorial no-go zone? Under-policing certainly didn't lead to a decline in crime there. She says the over-policing also means that you're going to document more crime. And I said, let me make sure I understand you. You are suggesting that there is not actually more crime in those areas and that they are just being over-documented? Where did you grow up? I'm not trying to be mean here in any way, but this doesn't make any sense. I grew up in those neighborhoods where more crime was everywhere. It was obvious. More policing does not magically make more crime happen. It just means more people are getting caught. The autonomous zones, the countries with weak police forces like Mexico, prove that. Black-on-black crime is propaganda. Have you ever spent any time in Chicago or Detroit? To be clear, all races statistically kill each other more often, but it's absolutely happening. It's not fiction or propaganda. I cover those numbers and statistics in my video about police shootings as well. Anyway, she says, but we're not talking about the rest of the world. We're talking about the USA and when ghettos were created and via discrimination laws and redlining. Poor people in this country are disproportionately black and brown. Crime rates are huge in those areas because of the CIA drug dump. This is kind of getting repetitive. The years of systemic racism that kept black and brown people from getting ahead of via education and the fact, you know what, I'm actually just going to read my version of it because I don't have to reread her twice. But anyway, quote, we're not talking about the rest of the world, we're talking about the USA and when ghettos were created. So I said, I'm pointing out the exact same effect happens all over the world. That's my point, is that it's not as if there are only ghettos in the United States and that the crime rates are not only high in poor places in the United States. This effect goes on everywhere. And it's not all, it's not all the white man who creates these situations. Poor, communities exist all over the world. Anyway, so she says, the years of systemic racism that kept black and brown people from getting ahead via education. And I said, well, how does this happen? Have you ever attended school in one of those communities? I recall kids hiding their report cards because they didn't want to be beat up for being a nerd. I recall getting jumped and attacked literally for using big words. I recall being a gangbanger being what every boy wanted to be and what every girl wanted to date. There is a cultural component to this that has to change. And I'm not exaggerating this. If you did well in school, if you were a smart kid, if literally you would get, it's not just like picked on, like they would beat you up. Oh, groups of them even would beat you up. And then she says, crime rates go up in areas where cops are able to report it. Over-policing an area equal higher crime rates because pigs are there to report. And I said, I've already challenged you on this issue and I'm waiting for a response. As I assure you, having grown up in those neighborhoods, that the crime is real. It's not over-reported and it's not over-policed. So like the fundamental flaw here to the logic, it reminds me of somebody who doesn't go to the doctors because they don't want to find out that they have cancer. The cancer's still there. And the crime in these neighborhoods is still there, even if there are no police to deal with it. And if you watch my videos about what took place, actually I did a whole long video about abolish police in general, talking about how the crime rates are very clear, and even Vox, which is a left-leaning outlet, reports this, that less police means more crime, period. Anyway, she says crimes happen in affluent neighborhoods all the time, but it's less reported because cops are too busy being in poor black and brown neighborhoods. So she's basically saying that just as much crime happens everywhere else, but it's not reported because the cops are not there to report it. This is just absolute nonsense. But anyway, I said, no. Every city has its own police department. And also having lived in affluent neighborhoods where there is less crime. There is less crime there, I mean. Absolutely. When I lived in the ghetto as a kid, every single bicycle I owned was stolen. When I lived in better neighborhoods, you could leave your bike outside your house without an issue. I have never been randomly assaulted living in affluent neighborhoods, yet I was hospitalized twice living in the ghetto and jumped dozens of times by people who didn't even know me. And then she says, also, I was also raised in the ghetto. And I said, really? So you're literally saying that not very much crime happened in your neighborhood. Can you give me the city? As I find this kind of odd. Now this post down here, she posted within 5 minutes of the first one. But this is her basically asking the admins to either get rid of me or that she should leave. She said, I thought this was progressives against neoliberalism, not neoliberals infiltrate a supposedly progressive space. Admin, should I leave? Let me know. And I said, wait, I thought we were about to have a good discussion. I'm trying to give you a chance to convince me. And she says, I'm trying to convince you, but I'm confused as to why you're confused. And so here's my reply. Because I don't just blindly accept what people say without hashing it out, one of the huge problems on the left now is to simply isolate ourselves in echo chambers and never engage with anyone who doesn't 1,000,000% agree with us on everything. We used to know how to debate. Now we just know how to censor people. It makes us look weak and makes people like Shapiro look strong. I'm not being cruel or impolite to you. I asked you direct and valid questions, and now you're asking the admins to take action just because I am not on your bandwagon. I am legitimately trying to give you a chance. I am a Bernie voter who is part of Occupy Wall Street, and I am not some brainwashed Trumper. But I also think for myself, and that means I analyze everything. I don't just simply say, oh, a leftist said that? Must be true. Let me just surrender my brain and go along with the mob. This is one of the pinnacle problems of this that makes it look like a cult. You know, it makes it look like, I remember during the Satanic Panic in the 80s, it was a time period when the church was really heavy into trying to police like what music we listened to, what toys we played with, you know, what video games we played, you know, and they came after Dungeons and Dragons and stuff like that. But they literally would always tell you just to not ever expose yourself to any outside influences. You know, not to ever be in situations that are contradictory, and to make sure you keep going to church every Sunday because that gets you your refill of propaganda. And this is not meant as an offense to anybody who's religious, but I'm pointing out that this is a religion. You know, that this is, she doesn't want to hear any blasphemy in her space. So that's why she wants the admins to simply get rid of me. And as you can see by the conversation that I had here, I wasn't rude to her. I'm listening to her. She's just saying stuff that doesn't make any sense. Like that supposedly the only reason there's more crime in those neighborhoods is because it's being reported due to over-policing. And I pointed out that the police response times in those places are so damn slow that that's why we have more crime. You know, like these things, it's not just about like a matter of opinion. It's just a fact. And anybody who's ever actually lived in those neighborhoods will tell you that. Let's see what she said in these new posts, if I can find them quickly. So the conversation starts to take a negative turn, as per typical. She says, you can learn via the internet and the library. There's a million ways one can become educated regarding systemic racism and what CRT actually is. You're regurgitating the Fox News Republican Democrat talking points, the Republican and the Democrat talking points, regarding race and CRT, which leads me to believe you did absolutely no research on the subject. Furthermore, you're not the only one who my comment here is about. So yes, I'm wondering where the admins are, because it's not my job to educate you. It's your job to educate yourself. That is, if you truly wish to learn. She gives me a list of books she wants me to read, but I said, she's like, I'm wondering where the admins are, and I'm like, why? Because you want me censored? And sorry, it is your responsibility to source and provide information if you make a claim. Every serious debate coach will tell you that, and any activist who actually wants to help people understand their position can do this. All of the videos I do in these topics are sourced with peer-reviewed studies, including ones I have to pay for. So I'm going to finish this segment just by reading this part, but she says, until you learn and understand intersectionality, you're never going to believe in systemic racism. Until you understand systemic racism, you're never going to understand the much-needed CRT being taught in class. Until you understand why CRT is needed, you're never going to understand the role white supremacy plays in capitalism. Until you understand that, you're never going to be able to dismantle capitalism. Well, so the funny thing is first of all, this line right here kind of like is her showing the truth, which is that this is really about communism. This is about fighting capitalism. But everything she said here is that this is all a big house of cards, and until you accept all of it, you won't understand any of it. You know, and with no offense meant to any of my religious fans out there, this is like a person who is Christian trying to argue with an atheist by quoting from the Bible. You know, until I accept these things that she demands that I simply accept, and that if I don't simply accept them, then I should be censored from this group. That's why she wants to know where the admins are. And that's why I said here, just answer this. Why do you want the admins? Do you feel I should be censored for asking questions? Because she wants to live in an echo chamber. She doesn't want any blasphemy or heresy around her. She wants to be able to safely practice her religion of wokeism and, you know, there in without any disruption. She doesn't want any non-believers in her presence. And if you challenge anything, then you're a heretic and should just simply be excommunicated. Nobody's going to be convinced with this. This doesn't help. Like, this isn't activism. Activism is about trying to bring more people into your perspective. And this doesn't work. It's actually embarrassing that this is what the left is like now. Thanks for listening. Oh, quick note. I realized that I forgot to talk about this slide that was released for the critical race theory proposals that are being brought up in my school district. I'll actually do a separate video about that topic. Thanks for listening.